Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today, along with Mustapha Price, the show's producer, and this is episode 253, where we're going to be talking about major events and what they mean for indie devs. Now, out of all the different ways games can get attention, the method that has stood the longest has been events. Well, major events like E3 started with a different intentions compared to today. It's a telling sign how the event landscape has shifted for numerous reasons, but one being the continued growth of indie games. Now, discussing everything from changing times to format and delivery of these events, Mustapha and I talk about the impact major events have had, but more importantly, ways to view and approach them as an opportunity to stand out. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey everybody, and we're back, and today, as I mentioned, I have our good old buddy here, Mustapha. Mustapha, how's it going, man?
I am doing great. How about yourself?
Not too bad. It's been a crazy few weeks for me, but otherwise it's been good. How about yourself?
About the same, yeah. A lot of catching up on projects and really pushing, the stuff with our game forward. That's been a lot of fun. And then also I've been working on some upcoming stuff for the YouTube front and even getting to play a game here or there. So it's been nice.
That's awesome. So I got to ask real quick for your game because it is a like a party kind of game or tabletop game essentially. Have you guys been able to do some more play testing? Because over where we are, restrictions have been kind of like lifted for a while now, and people are actually getting together. So I was just curious on that front.
Yes, so we've finally, thankfully we've got a few of our friends who are already vaccinated that we've been able to do some testing with, and we even used the most recent tests as an opportunity to kind of start to finalize what's going to be the first card set in our game.
Oh, sweet.
Including some pretty major balance changes that we haven't been able to address really since we started conceptualizing, so super exciting progress on that front.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, definitely great to hear. So thanks for sharing with that. And let's see, what else? I don't have anything else on my end, really. It's just been crazy busy, as I mentioned. Part of the reason for that is my wife went back to work temporarily, and I had to, one of my children was in school. I have two others that I had to care for during that time. So that was just a little chaotic with work and kids, but it was still a good time. Had some fun and interesting moments with the kids, that's for sure.
Well, that's awesome. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Have you got any, I know obviously you've been super busy, any games of note lately?
No, I haven't really seen anything that stood out to me recently. Well, some things honestly, they're just kind of a blur, but it's one of those things when I see them again, I'll totally recall them. And then for playing games, no. I think the closest I've gotten to playing a game was my son recently has just been getting into Injustice: Gods Among Us. So I haven't even played. I've just watched what he's doing, which is just a lot of button mashing. But that's okay because that's basically what I do.
Great game though.
Yeah, it's definitely a good one. But yeah, nothing too exciting on my front, unfortunately. But that's okay too. I don't mind. Oh, one quick thing. I have finally gone real mountain biking, and I mean going on hiking trails and climbing some stuff small boulders and stuff. I make it sound really crazy. I went on all the easy courses, but that was a lot of fun. So not game or industry related, but at least I did spend some time with a friend going on some trails that he was familiar with, and that was extremely rewarding and something new and different. So, but that's it. Otherwise, it's all the same.
Well, I mean, that sounds pretty exciting to me.
Yeah, it was fun. I look forward to doing it again. So, but yeah, so why don't we get into what we're going to be talking about today? And I'll let you introduce people, have you introduce people to our discussion today, because I think it's a really interesting one, but also important one in light of the industry, the climate, and all those things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot of us are familiar with what this season means for our industry, right? We typically have E3, the Electronic Entertainment Expo,
Yep.
and this year we actually did have a virtual version of the show,
Mm,
which is a first for E3. In addition to the fact that they did not have a show last year,
right.
so this has been a very, very heavily talked about presentation both critically as well as what it means for the future of the industry, what it means for the future of events in the industry.
Mm,
And of course, whenever that conversation comes up, uh, indie games are kind of one of the ever moving pong balls in that discussion.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
we're going to be discussing some details of the event today, as well as certain other events that are available aside from E3. And we're going to be discussing the staying power of these events, the ways in which they might change, and the future of this particular facet of the industry.
Yeah, I love it. So why don't we just then kick off a little bit with kind of like the whole future of all, here, actually let me take a I'm getting ahead of myself here. Why don't we look a little bit about the background in terms of events as a whole, kind of where they have been, and like especially with like E3, because I mean, like E3 is probably one of the most notable ones, and it's funny because that's one too that has been kind of, I would say, slow to change. Because what was it like? I don't know how many years ago, but once they started opening up the event to like the public, right? That wasn't that long ago that started
No, that was
happening.
like 4 years ago, I think.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I think that's a good place to start, to be like, hey, this is like the pinnacle of events, as or one of them, I should say, and how that progression of that example I just mentioned, and what does it mean for that event as a whole, and then as we start looking forward.
Right, right. So, yeah, I mean, a little background on what E3 is. The expo is put on by the Entertainment Software Association. They're responsible for a lot of campaigning for legislation around video games. They compile a lot of the stats on player data, a lot of interesting research and information you can gather from that group. The event was originally founded as kind of a trade event. So it was press only,
Mm,
really an opportunity for studios, developers, publishers, um, and other sorts of hardware companies outside of video games as well to report things like their numbers, certain upcoming projects that might be, uh, yeah, really kind of to generate buzz and conversation around shareholders, numbers, yada yada. As time has gone on, the announcements I think kind of became what E3 is known for, and the event over time became much more consumer focused rather than being just a media or press event. And then most recently, as we mentioned a few years ago, they finally opened the event up for public attendance. Last year, during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was not an E3 event at all. Um, there was talks initially of them doing something digital only, but eventually the expo had just been canceled.
yeah.
And this was their first year back after that hiatus, and it was a fully digital event. So we're not only looking at um, the first time that E3 has missed a year since it was founded, we're also looking at the first fully digital version of the show. So a lot of changes, a very, very, very different format. And as you get when there are massive changes like that, the show returned to mixed reception really across the board.
Yeah.
A lot of people questioning following the show whether or not it even has the staying power to survive in the industry at the stage that we're at.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting statement that a lot of people are making there. And it's not to say like, E3 is going away, but it's still a valid point in terms of, what does this really mean for the industry in the shift? And I think another important point that I want to make is simply, a lot of these things, and it's not just E3, right? Everybody had to make shifts because of COVID. But if we look back at to maybe what other people have been doing or other event organizers and things like that, I mean, the digital format was really something, or just not just digital format, other ideas in terms of what shows are and what the format is. This was always something that was going to happen. And it was just simply COVID that really expedited that whole process. Some people were really able to shift quite well into that changing climate, economic climate, and others just weren't really able in that position. And it's because of, I think, the history of E3 that Mustapha just laid out, that was just kind of that key example in terms of how difficult that shift could be. Because I mean, if you think about it, if you're so used to doing something one way, and you're that big of an entity, changes can be very difficult to happen, right? So I think that's what was really happening with E3 here. But again, the point, going back to my point, is I don't want to like say, hey, this happened and everything, so many else of other things happen strictly in terms of the topic of events happened because of COVID. COVID was just like a catalyst in this situation, but everything was going into that direction. It was just a matter of when and how fast.
Absolutely. And I think if you really like stop and take a look at, again, the history of the event, the cracks were starting to form years ago. And I think, a big part of what really set this in motion was actually Nintendo and their introduction of their Nintendo Direct style events. I think the days of packed theater press conferences for an event like E3 are probably long gone. Not just because it's easier for companies to handle these things internally, but just economically, it just makes more sense. No longer is there a need for E3 to be the place where you do all your big announcements because the entire industry is going to tune into a Nintendo Direct or a State of Play or an Xbox showcase. And I think an aside to that would be that because those things are now handled internally by a lot of the bigger companies, it offers smaller companies as well, smaller indie studios, the opportunity to expand into kind of their own version of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Yeah.
I think that's really where the issue of staying power comes from. It's not even necessarily that like, well, now the world's changed, we have to do digital forever. It's that, well, the world was already changing.
Yes.
Sony has been to E3 since like I think 2019 or 2018.
And
Because they just don't see it as necessary anymore.
And think about the reasons why, right? Like what is the driving force? And this applies to all you listening too. What is the driving force behind these types of events and everything else in terms of, just what is the driving force behind all this? It's consumers. It's your audience. It's the people that are going to buy the games and play them. I think sometimes that's a hard thing for people to grasp the concept. I mean, yes, at a high level, very simple to understand. But the point is, and this is through every industry, right? Consumers, whether it's another business like B2B, business to business, or D2C, which is direct to consumer, consumers, whoever's consuming the product, the service, or whatever, are going to drive the needs, right? So it's important to really consider that. And as times change, and as you just said, Mustapha, with like E3, from like press conferences all the way down to Nintendo doing their own direct stuff, these companies and you guys as indie developers are realizing like we really need to do something to cater to our audience, to the consumers, essentially, to your players. Like that's really what the focus is. Nintendo picked up on this long ago, and it's like why if we have now developed that clear channel